I just want to do a quick recap because we're about to finish up a conversation that feels like it's lasted a couple of months here on Sunday mornings, because it probably has lasted a couple of months on Sunday morning. And it's really the last big conversation that Matthew puts in his account of Jesus' life before you see the final events that lead up to Jesus' arrest, crucifixion, resurrection, all those things. And then Matthew wraps the book up shortly after that. But this is a huge conversation, and so we spent a little bit of time trying to figure things out. It also gets a little bit confusing. So here's a quick, 1.5 minute summary of that. At the beginning of this conversation, Jesus was describing this world where religious leaders, they're prioritizing money and outer appearances over people, and in the back of their minds, they're plotting on how they can kill Jesus. Does that sound like a religious leader you'd like to look up to? But that's the state of things. Jesus has been describing a world that is bent on hurting or killing or displacing his followers. He's been describing groups, entities that will eventually try to destroy and be successful at it, the temple structure in Jerusalem. He's been talking about a world that will continue to be characterized by these different cycles of war, cycles of conflict between different cultures and between people, natural disasters, a world that will repeatedly seek Jerusalem's desolation, a world of chaos. In short, a world that needs a huge change. And maybe if we look back on history over the past couple thousand years, we can kind of relate with that. Even if we turn on the news, right? If we pull out our smartphones today and we flip open a news app, we'll see examples of some of these things still taking place today. And then after that point, Jesus tells 3 parables. These are different stories, and each story is meant to compare the story that Jesus tells with some aspect of life in God's kingdom, or detail about who Jesus is and the way that Jesus operates, or the way that the life, that Jesus is teaching about works. And so to contrast that story or compare that story with the way that life should or shouldn't be operating in Jesus' community of followers, to show little glimpses into what this change that the world so desperately needs could actually look like. We get small little windows into what life in the kingdom of God is actually like. And hence the title that you see behind me, this has been the whole book of Matthew, Matthew's whole story about not just looking forward to this future hope of Jesus' return, which he also speaks about in this conversation, but also trying to bring aspects of that into the present so that we don't just tolerate and deal with the chaos from every day and try to survive this life, hoping someday we'll get out, we'll make it out and move on to something better. Maybe it's possible to bring a taste of Jesus' kingdom into our life and the lives of the people around us right now. I think that's what Jesus has been kind of hinting at. The other option is that we just use kind of our misplaced fears, our ideas about God that may be incorrect, fears of who he is, or maybe even just laziness and apathy. Those things will drive us, and they'll instead extinguish those efforts to bring little tastes of God's kingdom through our life here on earth. So that's been the context of this whole conversation. And so this is how Jesus wraps up the conversation this morning, and then we move on to other events in the last days of Jesus' life on earth. And what happens now is that Jesus is looking toward the future when he says the Son of Man will return. And that's the title he uses to refer to himself. He says, someday I'm going to return. I'm going to come back, and I'm going to set the wrongs in this world right. I'm going to make some changes. And that's what we step into today. So the first verse, this is Matthew 25, starting in verse 31. We've got the verses up there if you want to follow along. But this is how Jesus ends this conversation, the beginning of that end. He says, when the Son of Man, or the Son of humanity, speaking of himself, comes in his glory, and all the angels or messengers with him, then he'll sit on his glorious throne. So Jesus obviously has a vision of this glorious, magnificent, splendorous thing. When you look out at the world around you today, you probably see some aspects of glory and splendor. When I drive through Zion Park in that area in Springdale, I'm just confronted with this majestic view everywhere, right? So I see glimpses of God's glory and splendor. I even see people glimpses of God's glory and splendor. But there's a whole lot of things that still need changing, at least from my point of view. What do you think a world that was finally set right would look like? What are some things that you think a king who was going to, abolish the injustices and the pains that are currently happening, what would that look like? What would that new world look like? What do you think? Yes?
No evil.
Okay, no evil. All right. Yes?
Joy.
Joy. Okay, what else? What do you envision in a glorious world? Like, this thing just got redone. Yeah.
No poverty.
No poverty? Okay, what were you going to say?
Everyone would be capable of having empathy.
Empathy. Yeah, everybody would be capable of having empathy, she said. Yes?
Everyone living in harmony.
Everybody living in harmony, right? No like conflict. Yes?
No disease or cancer.
No disease or cancer, maybe physical suffering. Anything else? What would this world look like? Yeah?
No fear.
No fear. Yeah, we don't know a world like that, right? So many things we struggle with. Yes?
No pain.
No pain. These are all the kinds of changes, maybe and more, that we should think of related to this. And the basic gist of, I think, that glorious, basically the Son of Man will set up a glorious throne. Things are going to change. Life on earth is going to be drastically offered in a lot of ways. And maybe there are some steps that a king would take to bring about some of the things that you've mentioned. Empathy, a lack of pain. Some of that might take supernatural efforts, right? To strike out cancer or disease from a world, right? That would take some, supernatural power, it would seem like, at least to me, right? And even harmony, relationships, a lack of conflict, those kinds of things. Like, that would be a very different world, right? But there's one thing that Jesus is going to focus on in this conversation that would definitely need to change about the way the world currently operates in order for a glorious kingdom to show up on earth. And that one thing is that there'd have to be a separation. And that's what Jesus is going to talk about in the next few verses that we discussed this morning. Here's how he describes it. And he's not necessarily in parable mode. It seems like he's kind of like in narrative mode. So he's telling stories, and maybe this will kind of be, something of what to expect. Not just a parable, but more, this is what's going to happen. Future history, maybe. But also in what Jesus says, he uses some metaphors to try to describe things. There's still a little bit of ambiguity or uncertainty. We don't know exactly all the details of what Jesus is talking about. But it seems like he's actually talking about the way things will go down, something he will do in the future to bring about a change on the earth, a drastic change. He says in verse 32, all the nations, and by the word nations, he's talking about distinct cultures. That's the Greek word behind nations. So all these different cultures will be gathered together. If you think about the world today, there's cultures around every corner, right? So he's going to bring these cultures together. It says he'll separate them. And the idea is he's going to mark off some boundaries, like you're over here and you're over here, one from another, just like a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. How many of you have a lot of personal experience working with farms or being shepherds or shepherdesses today? Anybody out there? I know a lot. Oh, okay, yeah, that's right. I forgot about you, Leroy. You did. Yeah, you have had experience. So maybe you can give us some input on that. I want you to kind of use your imagination a little bit, and if you have any experience, like you do, Leroy, with working with herds of animals, why do you think a shepherd would separate sheep from goats? We don't live like in an extremely agrarian society, most of us today, so we're kind of disconnected from this example Jesus is going to use. So we got to kind of step into the mindset of a herdsman or herdswoman, right, for this. So why would you separate sheep from goats? What do you think? And Leroy, if you have any personal experience, let us know. So what do you think? Why would they do that? Yes?
Sheep were considered more valuable than goats.
Okay. Perhaps. I don't know that much about that. So Tracy said sheep are considered more valuable than goats. Certainly with the wool, in today's economy, they would be that way. I was doing some research and I found out how many thousands of dollars people get from wool, through these operations. And it can be a pretty lucrative business if you have enough land and enough head of sheep. So yeah. What else? Why would you separate them? Yes?
Sheep are more calm, docile animals, where goats are a little more wild and crazy. They jump.
Yeah, she said sheep are more docile and goats are a little more wild and crazy, right? They jump. And I think that's actually a huge part of it. Again, I was doing some research on this, like why you would do that. Goats are pretty aggressive animals. The other thing about goats is they all have horns for the most part. Most species of them, the male and the female goats. And sheep, the rams have horns, but the goats, they not only have horns like across the board, but they're also more aggressive. When they headbutt, they like rear up and slam in to the other goats instead of just like sheep just kind of go at it on the same level. But so they're, a different level of aggressiveness. Why else do you think you would want to separate them?
The goats will dominate over the sheep.
Okay.
Headbutting.
Yeah, Leroy said goats will dominate the sheep. That's something that I found to be true as well, just based on research and you based on reality. They'll try to lead them or take over or physically dominate them as well. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? We're not going to camp on this forever, but just thought I'd ask. Yes? Sheep taste better than goat. I don't know. I've had goat before. I spent some time in Africa 10 years ago, and goat's on the menu there, so probably right. Sheep probably taste better maybe to you than goats, so.
I like feeding them their bottles.
Yeah, you like feeding them their bottles? Nice. So basically, another thing with goats are foragers, and they'll eat a lot of stuff, almost everything. And they'll tear apart a pasture and trees and bushes and shrubbery and strip everything and eat fencing and all this. And they don't like to be confined. Sheep, on the other hand, they're okay with, limiting themselves to a specific area. They're okay with just eating the grass and not destroying everything. They're also okay with following a shepherd. Whereas with the goats, it's almost like the herder follows the goats and they do their own thing and they try to, kind of keep them reined in. But with sheep, they'll actually follow a shepherd. Yes?
Goats will climb on your car.
Goats will climb on your cars. That's true. Yeah. That's good enough for me to separate the goats and the sheep, right? They don't climb on my car. They have to stay in their boundaries. And so just like that, it says these groups, the king, the son of human, it's Jesus figure in the future, it seems, is going to separate sheep from goats. It's hard for them to coexist because they're very different personality-like. And it says in verse 32, he, this king, who from context seems to relate to Jesus himself when he returns someday in the future, he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. There's a couple things going on in the Bible as well. Whenever you hear about sheep and goats, normally the sheep are spoken of in more of a favorable light and the goats in the less favorable, maybe because they're a little more destructive, as animals by nature. Also, when you hear about the right in the Bible, it's typically associated with favor and power, those kinds of things, blessing. But when you hear about the left, normally it has a little different context. In fact, in the Greek language, the left, the way that they would say on your left, they would say on the side of the good name. Because in Greek culture, the left side was considered lucky, but the Jewish people would kind of use it as a euphemism, as a joke, kind of, and say, yeah, it's your lucky side. But they would mean just the opposite, right? The left side is really the unlucky side, or, the disfavored side. And so already when you're reading this story, if you're a Jewish person, you're thinking, oh, I see where this is going. Goats, left, not good. Sheep, right, good things, favorable things. So you can already see where this is headed. The right hand communicates more favor instead of a lack of luck or bad consequences. And it says in verse 34, we're going to hit a few verses and we're going to skip ahead a little bit because there's a couple different sections of this. We're going to focus on it by section, not necessarily just in order by verses. It says, then the king will say to those on his right, who are the sheep, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom permanently prepared for you from the foundation of the world, or from the time I ordered this universe. Come receive this kingdom. Then he will also say to those on the left, the unfavored side, depart from me. And that word depart, it means go on your journey past me. Pursue your journey, go ahead. Don't stay here. Go on your way from me. You who are cursed. And this is kind of strong language. Jesus doesn't usually speak like this. You who are cursed. And the idea behind the curse is written in a tense in the Greek that it's a permanent condition kind of thing. It's once and for all this. So there's definitely a distinguishing mark between these two groups. And then it says, into the eternal or perpetual fire prepared for the devil Now, the word devil is just a word that means a false accuser. So the devil is not a proper name of the devil. It's this figure that's always about making false accusations of other people. So he's called the slanderer, the false accuser, because that's what this character in Scripture, who we call the devil, that's what he's always about, making these false accusations. So prepared for the false accuser and his angels or his messengers. And then it says, and they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. And I want to camp out on this because I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to import our own thoughts and ideas and say, well, I see what this is talking about here. So let's slow down for a minute and just take things a little bit of a step-by-step approach. So here's what's happening in what Jesus is saying. Whoever the righteous is, the sheep, whoever that group is that's been separated away from the goats, or this group who is referred to as cursed, they're going to receive some allotment in God's kingdom. And the cursed are going to continue on their journey away from the king, because that's what goats do. Goats do their own thing. They're independent. They go where they want to go, and they don't want to follow a shepherd. And so the goats are going to be allowed to continue to be goats, and the sheep are going to be welcomed into this kingdom where they'll have a shepherd, where they have an allotment that Jesus says has been prepared for them. And so there's two different, boundaries, essentially, given to them. And then there's a focus on the goats, the ones that Jesus describes as cursed in some way. They'll accompany the false accuser, who our translations say the devil, and his other messengers to a place of some kind of ongoing consequences. And there's a couple ways to take that. There's a mention of eternal fire here. And there are believers who take that quite literally and think they're going to be marched off into some, eternal place that, somehow is characterized by actual flame and fire. And then there's a metaphorical sense where the Bible uses fire a lot of times, and it's not talking about necessarily literal fire. It's talking about a valley called Gehenna, which is the trash heap outside Jerusalem, where the worthless things go, where there is burning, where there's death, those kinds of things metaphorically. And then fire is also used as a purifying agent. Talk about purification. And so there's a lot of room within these metaphors for different believers to land on slightly different interpretations. I would say none of them are great, but they can vary. And this idea of eternal or perpetual fire, this idea of eternal punishment and cursing, these are some of the terms and the options within those different metaphors and those different descriptions. It's some kind of consequence. It's some kind of a separate space. And it might include sadness. It might include regret. It might include anger and hatred. When Jesus speaks about fire or eternal fire, he often uses the phrase where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that communicates sadness, and it communicates like the anger and the hatred that come across so much that you would grit your teeth down because you're so angry. So wherever the goats go, there's, a continued independence, separation from the shepherd and his kingdom, and more regret, more sadness, more anger and hatred, more selfishness, and then the term punishment, which is actually a broad term as well. It can mean correction. It can mean refinement. It can mean actual, consequences. And it's even used in the Greek language to talk about capital punishment, which is like the punishment to end all punishment, right? So it's broad. But there's two different terms that are used a lot of times to communicate some sort of punishment in the Bible. One has to do with vengeance, and then the other one is this word that's used here in this passage. So what this is not teaching is that this is God's vengeance. This is the king saying, finally, I've put up with you for thousands of years, and now you're going to get it. We have raccoons in our yard that come in often, that live who knows where, off in the desert around us. And they continually wreak havoc on the chickens that we have, on our yard, on different things. And there are days where my heart desires nothing but vengeance on those animals. I want to eradicate them, and I want to eliminate them because they've eaten my chicken, or they've done this thing, and I'm just so angry. And that's not the response of the king here. He is not just fed up and angry and saying, finally, they'll have their day. They'll get a taste of what they deserve. It's not that. It's this idea of, actually Plato speaks of this word and outlines the differences. This is in a work called Protagoras. It was written like centuries before the time of Jesus, but it's a dialogue with Socrates. And the way that he describes the difference between the vengeance kind of punishment and the word that's used here, he essentially says this kind of punishment used in this text is aimed at preventing whoever's caused the harm and others who see that person punished from doing wrong again in the future. It's meant to remove the possibility of the same injustice and mistreatment from happening in the future. And that's the idea behind this in Jesus' conversation. He's saying the world has gone on for too long with all these cycles of war and conflict and mistreatment and injustice after injustice after injustice. And if I allow people who have been perpetuating that to remain in this kingdom that I'm creating without putting them somewhere else, without separating them with some boundary, then the same cycles that have been going on are going to continue to go on. And so it's Jesus' effort to do something to improve the condition of life in his kingdom, not to enact some sort of revenge, because he's a vengeful person. The aim is to create a better quality, to create some of the things that you were talking about, an empathetic place, a compassionate world. And so he's doing some separation of some sort. What does that exactly look like? I don't know. I guess we'll know when we get there. How that works, where that place of separation is, exactly what form it takes. But there's some room in the language and the metaphors that are used to land on slightly different, descriptions of what that place is like. But it is a consequence, and it is aimed at creating a better world in Jesus' kingdom. And there's a part of that conversation, that was the beginning and the end, but there's a part in the middle where Jesus describes that difference between those people who are termed righteous and the people who are termed, cursed, the sheep and the goats. What's the difference between those two groups? And it might be different than what you would assume. I think for a lot of times, for a lot of years as a Christian, I would have said, if somebody would come up to me and said, what's the difference? And they'd only heard the portion of the story that I've just read to you. What's the difference between the sheep and the goats? I would have told them, the sheep are the ones who believe in Jesus, and the goats are the ones who don't. But that's not exactly how Jesus explains it in the story. And again, the context of this is when these different cultures and nations are brought from around the world before him, and some are brought into this kingdom that he's creating, and some are not. And so this is not necessarily describing some, eternal state and some final judgment somewhere in a different dimension. This is a separation that's happening, it seems like, in real time on the earth at some point in the future. But there's a practical point. Again, it's to create the kind of world and an environment in his kingdom where these travesties that have been happening are less likely to happen. But this is how Jesus describes the difference between a righteous person and a cursed person in the story, between a sheep and a goat. He says to the ones who are termed righteous in verse 35, back in verse 35, he says, I was hungry. And this isn't like, I felt kind of hungry. I mean, how many of you are hungry right now? A few of you, right? How many of you are starving because you haven't had food in a week, right? And you're pained with hunger, and you feel like your stomach is just going to start eating you from the inside out. That's the type of hunger that's being described here. Jesus says, I was starving, and you gave me something to eat. You sheep did. He says, I was thirsty. I was suffering from thirst. Not just thirsty. I was suffering from thirst. I can go 3 days without water, something like that, and I needed it. And you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger. And the word stranger is a very specific term. It's talking about a foreigner who's living in a foreign land. So somebody from a different country who's dwelling in your country, essentially, for a period of time. And he says, you took me in. You welcomed me. Other people pushed me away because I was of a different culture, but you actually welcomed me in. He says, I was naked. And this is a term, it doesn't necessarily mean literally naked, but it means insufficiently clothed. Like it was cold outside and I didn't have a coat. And you were the one who threw something around me to warm me. You noticed I didn't have adequate clothing and you stepped in. Jesus says, I was sick. And the word sick is broad too. It can mean somebody who's weak, somebody who's needy, somebody who's like diseased, somebody who has a chronic illness. He says, and you took care of me. You looked in on me repeatedly. Like you kept checking in on me to see how I was doing and in my condition. I was in prison, like for an ongoing period of time, and you visited me. You came near me when other people wouldn't come near me. Maybe that's a physical prison for a crime, or maybe that's an emotional prison, or maybe that's an addictive prison, but you came near me when other people wouldn't. So there's one characteristic that separates the sheep from the goats, and it seems to be compassion here. The sheep are convicted by God's justice, and I want us to talk a little bit more about that in the Christmas season. What is God's justice? It's a little bit more than maybe what we import into it, and that's a longer conversation. And it appears from the context, these sheep, if they're entering into the kingdom and the king is finally arrived, based on Jesus' story before this, there have been some pretty chaotic events that have been happening. These different human cycles have grown in intensity. Right before there was a completion, in the same way that labor pains intensify before there's a birth, and Jesus' arrival, as compared to the birth and the way things are going in the world seem to be intensifying before this. And, if things are intense, it seems like it's even harder to care about somebody else because you're just so busy caring about yourself and making sure that you're doing all right. But these sheep, they've been concerned about other people's needs, even in these culminating cycles of disaster or war or conflict, when resources are scarce, when persecution is high. They have been selfless. They have been compassionate in those moments. They feed the starving. They satisfy the thirsty. They welcome the foreigner. They clothe the insufficiently clothed. They comfort the sick and isolated and ill. They visit those who are imprisoned or afflicted. That's what happens. They're different. And Jesus says in the story, then the righteous, the sheep, those who are on this one side on his right hand, they'll answer and they'll say, Lord, we didn't see you hungry and feed you. When did we see you hungry? We didn't see you thirsty. When did we see you thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you like a foreigner and take you in, or insufficiently clothed and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? Jesus, we didn't see you. We saw these people, but we didn't see you. And it says the king will answer them. And again, it seems like in the story, the king is Jesus himself. Truly I tell you, he says, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did. Our translation here says for me. It's not exactly accurate. It's not just for me, it's to me. There's a little bit of a difference there, right? If you do something for someone, it's like, ultimately it kind of benefited them somehow. But if you do it to them, it's very direct. And so Jesus is saying, when you did that to someone else that you saw, you actually unknowingly, you did this directly to me. And when he says the least of these brothers and sisters, the least, again, has a wide range of meaning. It means smallest, but it can be smallest in importance. These people weren't important, at least not in the eyes of a lot of people, but you took time out for them. It could be in terms of status. These people didn't have a high status in society. They weren't respected in society, but you cared about them, even though they were kind of one of these marginalized groups that doesn't get a lot of help or attention. It can be authority. This person didn't have much authority at all. Or it can be power. They didn't have much ability or talent or strength or opportunity to help you. They were kind of a weak person, maybe physically or whatever. But yet, you were concerned about them. He says you did it to me. So the king considers seeing and satisfying vulnerable people as seeing and satisfying himself. And that's what sets apart these two groups of people. And then there are questions that poses too. Why would someone care about vulnerable people, even if that meant having a lack of their own resources or putting themselves at risk? What would cause someone to do that? And maybe when we start to jump into those questions, we see that it's more than just the outward action. There's something that's different in the heart of the person. So maybe it's deeper than just the sheep have compassion and the goats don't. Maybe there's a change that's happened in the heart, and maybe something caused that change. But it definitely does have a change, and it definitely affects change as well. And then Jesus also has a conversation with the goats in this, and that's where we'll wrap up. He says, I was hungry, and you goats, you didn't give me anything to eat, because, goats eat everything, right? So, I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger in a foreign land, you didn't take me in. I had insufficient clothes, and you didn't clothe me. I was sick, and I was in prison, and you didn't take care of me. And then they're going to say, Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or thirsty? If we would have seen you, the king, hungry or thirsty, don't you think we would have stepped in? When did we see you without clothes or sick or imprisoned? If we would have seen you, we would have stepped in. We would have helped. And then he says, truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do. Doesn't really say for me, it says to me. You didn't do it to me. So Jesus personalizes the treatment of people. We know way back in the beginning in Genesis that God created humanity in his own image. And it's a very deeply personal thing to him when humanity is mistreated with injustice and when humanity is looked on with favor, with compassion. It's a huge thing, and it makes a huge impact because Jesus personalizes it. And he very much sees it as something that we do not just for him, to serve him, but we do it directly to him. And again, this is something that's set in the future at the time of the return of this king. But the question that I ask myself is, what can we learn from this today? If this is such a huge thing that characterizes God's kingdom in the future, to where he would have to separate out, some who are not noticing, some who don't care, because there's no room for cruelty and injustice in God's kingdom, is there maybe a similar need in his kingdom today? Maybe we don't have the fullness of things here on earth, but we're supposed to bring about a taste of it. And if the taste that we're bringing is something that is uncaring, that considers ourselves above other people, that ignores some of these basic needs of vulnerable people, that's really cruel and unjust, then are we any better than they, right? Are we able to represent God's kingdom any better? And so I think that's where the challenge applies to us. This, I think, is a conversation about perhaps something in the future that we don't know all the details about, that we've discussed. But it has implications that challenges us for us in every day of how we live our life. Are we going to live like a sheep? We live like a goat? Because every day is an opportunity for that.